Shalom Alechem, Assalamu Alaikum, Eirini Mazisu. I have to practice that one. And Pax Vobiscum. In English, peace be unto you. This is Judges chapter 16, and we're going to start looking at verse 3 out of 31 verses. It says here, mountain versus a hill. And we can see that Samson Samson took the hold of the doors of the gate, and he lifted them, he carried them on his shoulders. Now in the Masoretic, you'll notice he brought them to the top of the hill. And that's all he did. He just brought them there. Whereas in the Septuagint, we can see that he also let them rest there. He laid them down there. So that was their final destination. In verse 5, talking about his wife, the princes of the Philistines came up to Samson's wife and said to her, "Beguile him," which means to trick him. Entice him means something completely different. It means to seduce. Here it says the Hebrew, rumi, to be, to make. Okay, you know what? I'm going to open that in a new tab. Let's just see what that means, because in the English, in the Septuagint, it means to trick, to beguile, to deceive. Okay, and this is the word patha in Hebrew, to be spacious, to be simple, entice, deceive, persuade. To be gullible, to seduce. So again, yeah, it does mean seduce, but it can also mean deceive. So it's got this word has many connotations. So I just feel like beguile is more focused, whereas entice is a little more vague. Next, in verse 7, talking about the cords that Delilah used to bind Samson with, talks about they were 7 moist cords that have not been spoiled versus 7 green widths. 7 green widths. So what is a width? An overhanging, excess, superiority. A small rope, okay? So 7 moist cords. So they are moist, that have not been spoiled or dried. So they are moist, not dried. I'm not sure what spoiled means. Perhaps it means they have not been used. And next is verse 10. Delilah responds to Samson, "Behold, you have cheated me," versus mocked her. It's one thing to just mock her, to deride her, but it says here by implication to cheat. So they're kind of very open-ended here. It's sort of, in case we're wrong, it's going to mean this, but no, here it's just clear it is cheated. It's not mocking her or just making fun of her. She believes that Samson is cheating her. In verse 12, this is talking about people who are lying in wait. The Philistines are lying in wait, came out of the chamber. Okay, so they came out of the room. Or maybe it came out of the room they were hiding in. Makes more sense. Why would they be in the room with them and then come out? I'm sure Samson would notice a bunch of men in their bedroom. In the Masoretic, it says the liars in wait, abiding in the chamber. So they're just waiting there. They've been there the whole time, but it seems like they were in another room and they came out of that room to go get Samson. But it seemed to be a false alarm because, he broke off the ropes like a thread. So it seems they fled as a result. And I also want to point out in verse 12, this is a narrative. This is the narration of what actually happened. It says, let me just read it as it's supposed to be read. "And Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them, And the liars in wait came out of the chamber, and she said, "The Philistines upon you, Samson." So maybe they were in the chamber. I'm open to that idea that they were possibly waiting in the room with them, and then they fled, or they were in another chamber and went into their room and then fled. In either case, this is a narration happening. This is the narrative in the Septuagint. In the Masoretic, this is Delilah making a verbal statement. She's saying to Samson, said to him, "The Philistines upon you, Samson, and liars in wait abiding in the chamber." So it could be part of the narrative as well here, or it could be part of a verbal statement. Depends how you read it, because again, there is no punctuation in either the Septuagint or the Masoretic. You have to insert that yourself. Just to the translators insert that to make sense of the text. It could read, "The Philistines be upon you, Samson, and liars in wait abiding in the chamber." And then it says, "And he broke them off," the ropes. Okay, so it's not clear that it is her verb, or not verb, her verbiage, her statement, that she's verbalizing this, but it could be possible that this is part of Delilah's statement instead of the narrative. Whereas in the Septuagint, it is clear it is the narrative. She's not speaking until here, where she said, "The Philistines upon you, Samson." And then that's the end of her statement. Verse 13, Delilah responds to Samson, says to him, "You have deceived me." So even stronger language than beguile, deceiving her. But in this Masoretic, she continues to say, you're cheating me, you're mocking me. It's just repetition, just reiterating what she previously said in verse 10. Okay, and there's an omission as well in verse 13. It says here, "I entreat you." So she was pleading to Samson, and "you should fasten them with the pin." So this is Samson telling her his secret weakness, supposedly. Fasten his hair with the pin into the wall. So that was omitted. You don't just fasten his hair, but you fasten it into the wall. His hair must have been really long to do that. "Then shall I be weak as another man." So these are Samson's instructions to Delilah in the Septuagint, whereas in the Masoretic, it's simply the narrative describing what Delilah did. It says, "If you weave," okay, so that's actually in verse 14. "And she fastened with a pin and said to him," so that's part of the narrative. Whereas in the Septuagint, this is his statement, so that was omitted altogether. Continuing in verse 14, another omission of Samson actually falling asleep. There's no record of Samson actually falling asleep, though it is inferred or implied because he had to wake up out of his sleep. But in the Septuagint, it does mention that when he was asleep, that Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and did as he told her to do. And then it says, "Pin of the web out of the wall." So when Samson woke up, the pin of the web that she bound his hair with came out, but he also tore it out of the wall. He was strong enough to just break free from its hold. Versus pin of the beam. So beam could be wall as well. It's hard to say, or it could just simply be like a column. But this is the pin of the web, which is lodged into the wall. It's pinned securely, fastened there into the wall. So is it a flat wall, or is it a part of the wall which is like a beam? I'm open to either possibility. Verse 15, we can see the continuous difference of the word deceived, as well as the word mocked in both translations. Verse 16, there's an omission of the word sore. So Delilah was pressuring Samson continually or daily in the Masoretic, but pressing him sore. So she was really pushing to a very large extent. And it says here, and straightened him, that his spirit failed almost to death. Notice that very poetic expression. Verses, and urged him. So urging him instead of pressuring him. So it's just evolving, I suppose. And urged him. So pressing him is another way to translate that. So that his soul was vexed unto death. So doesn't seem to be much of a difference. However, when you look at the word straighten, it actually has an Old English definition of to mean to distress. So she is distressing him. She is perhaps restricting his freedom or hampering him. Okay, there's multiple meanings for this word, but distress seems to make sense. Hampering his spirit. So he was just, perhaps he was depressed, I don't know, but it affected his emotions to the point that his spirit failed almost to death, or his soul in the Masoretic. Verse 17, Samson describes himself as a set apart one, or a holy one of God, versus a Nazarite, relates to the Nazarite vow. Not so much, not that they aren't separate or set apart, but it's just worded differently. In verse 18, it says, okay, before I get there, verse 17 says, I shall be as all men, versus I shall be and be like any man. So we can see that, yeah, in the Septuagint, he's saying I'll be like all other men. All other men, which means, normal or regular. Natural strength versus any man. So any man could be a little confusing because it's like, take your pick, which man do you want me to be? But that's not what he meant. He meant all other men that are weaker than me versus any man, which can be a little confusing, to be honest. Verse 18 says here, told me. Delilah saw that he told her all his heart. And then she expressed to the Philistines, come up yet this once, for he has told me all his heart, versus showed me all his heart. You can't really show someone all your heart. That means they know you inside and out. But he told her all his heart. And this is a clear betrayal. She betrayed him, backstabbed him, without a doubt. This is not a mutual beneficial relationship they have. This is parasitic, in my opinion. Okay, and verse 19, we see a continuous difference of the word humble being used versus to afflict, but they are very close in meaning. Verse 23, it says, their Elohim, that name, not going to say it. They said, Elohim has given into our hand. So they're saying this is the real Elohim to them anyway, the Philistines. Elohim has given into our hand our enemy versus our Elohim. So they take ownership of their Elohim in the Masoretic, whereas they identify their Elohim as the true Elohim. That's the one Elohim. There's no other Elohim. Is kind of the implication by them saying that, just calling their Elohim Elohim, which he is not a real Elohim, or not the Elohim anyway. Verse 24, significant difference. I think it's our first one. The people saw Samson, and what did they do in reaction? They sang praises to their Elohim. They broke out in song. They were so happy. I often say in my own life that, Someone is really happy, they're very joyous, their heart is full of joy because they do one of two things or both of them. Number one, they sing, and number two, they dance. So here they're singing praises to their Elohim. They're that happy. So what did they do in the Masoretic? Did they break out in song? No, they praised their Elohim, which could simply mean giving word lip service to their Elohim. Does not necessarily mean that they sang, because praise could be more than just, or could be less than singing. So it has multiple connotations, but praising and singing praises are different. There's a distinction there. Verse 25. Now this can get into some, excuse me. Let me just pause for a moment. Okay, so getting back to verse 25, they bring out Samson and they make a statement, or they say something. They say this specifically. Excuse me. Let him play before us versus make us sport. Now, I'm not going to say there's a big difference in that, because it essentially seems to be the same kind of spirit. What they want him to do essentially is to entertain them. So I'm going to get into that Old English definition of to play, to sport. So sport means to make merry. So again, to entertain them, to give them some fun, a diversion, mirth, merriment, mockery. That seems to make sense. Let us make a mockery out of him, like a jester, like he's a clown. To flirt, to play, to jingle, the diversion of the field, to make merry, to wanton. Okay, so as you can see, there's many meanings, but recall as well. There was mention of Ishmael making sport or sporting with Isaac, and if you watch that video I presented, there seems to be much more than simply entertaining or just fooling around with or mocking. Seems to be something more sinister going on, perhaps something life-threatening, perhaps something even to do with sexuality, perhaps. So I'm open to those possibilities as well, that they exploited Samson in a way that he was not comfortable with, in terms of maybe putting his life in danger, perhaps, or abusing him in a inappropriate way, sex, that in that way. I'm not sure, but in any case, it does say play, make sport. So they were not taking him seriously. They were making a mockery of him. They're using him as entertainment, for their amusement. And there are some big differences coming up, so buckle up. In the same verse, now this kind of touched me a little bit. I felt bad for Samson when I read this. It says, so he did play before them. He came out of the prison house. What did they do to him, the Philistines? They smote him with the palms of their hands. So you can see, they did abuse him. They did do something to threaten his safety, his health. They beat him up. They hit him. They were striking him. And I'm sure they probably made him bleed as well, to the point of bloodshed. So that was completely omitted from the Masoretic, and that's why it's a big difference. There's no mention of them physically abusing him, and he becomes a much more sympathetic character. Samson does. So, and that's not the only difference. Let's keep going. In verse 27, it says here, the sports of Samson. 3,000 men and women looking at the sports of Samson. And I'm just going to double check whether that is a typo. It my hard copy edition. I'll have to do that later. So they were looking at the sports of Samson versus they beheld while Samson made sport. So what is the sports of Samson? That could be perhaps his nakedness. I'm not sure, or just his entertainment. Whatever he was doing as entertainment, or just him being mocked. Maybe that was the sports of Samson, them beating him up. Maybe that's what it was. I'm not sure. But they were using him as amusement, entertainment. And then verse 28, another big difference that we don't notice in the Masoretic. Samson wept. Now, a lot of us, me, at least I think of Samson as a tough guy. You know, a big, massive, muscular man, masculine, stoic. Not so in the Septuagint. It says here, Samson wept before Yah and said, Yah, my Adonai, remember me. I pray you and strengthen me. You really got to feel for this man. He was being beat up. He already was blinded. He had his eyes gouged out, and now he's weeping without eyeballs, but he is weeping. In the Masoretic, it's not expressed that way. It says he called to Yah. So he's simply verbalizing, calling out, not emotionally weeping. He isn't tearing up. He isn't to that emotional state. He's just calling out as if he's not affected emotionally. Okay, and verse 28, there's an extra I pray thee that was added in the Masoretic. And it says, I will requite. So Samson saying, I will requite one recompense to the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Versus, I may be at once avenged. So in the Masoretic, he's basically saying, okay, they took my 2 eyes. I'm going to avenge my 2 eyes. The Septuagint, he's saying, okay, they took my 2 eyes. I'm going to return one payment to them. I'm going to give them one payment for these 2 eyes that were taken. So you can see there's a measure of one recompense. So he's balancing the 2 eyes with one recompense, whereas in the Masoretic, it's not 1 for 2. It's simply, I'm going to be avenged right now, at once. So it's to do with timing, not to do with quantity. So I'm going to denote that. So quantity versus chronology. Okay. And then moving on to verse 29, there's an addition of middle. So it's talking about the pillars. There are 2 middle pillars in the Masoretic. Another significant difference says that he leaned on them. Samson leaned on the pillars and laid hold of one with his right hand and the other with his left. So what's the difference here? In the Masoretic, it says, and on which it was borne up, the pillars, the house was borne up by the pillars, of the one with his right hand and of the other with his left. So it's talking about the pillars themselves. The Masoretic is describing the pillars, what they look like. There's one on the right, one on the left. In the Septuagint, it seems that he's leaning on them. Okay, he's leaning on the pillars, but he's also holding them. So there is a possibility that he grabbed the pillars. Were they thin enough for him to grab onto? That's the question. And then we're going to finish up this video with verse 30. It's a big difference. And let me tell you why. It says here, Samson said, okay, let's read the Masoretic first so you just get the impact, you feel the impact of the statement. Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Period. And then he did what he did, and they all died, including Samson. So Samson is basically saying, I know I'm going to die. He's talking to God. Let me die with the Philistines. Okay, what is he saying in the Septuagint? Is he saying, let me die? No. He's saying, let my wife die. Let my wife perish with the Philistines. Why? She betrayed him. Remember earlier where she told the Philistines, he has revealed to me told me all his heart. So you can see Samson, that didn't go over Samson's head. He knew of her betrayal. And so she's saying, don't only let me repay the Philistines for what they did to my eyes, but let me also repay my wife for what she did to me. You know, there's a saying that a woman scorned, hell hath no fury like a woman who has been scorned. But we can see Samson has been scorned by his wife, and so he's returning to her head what she's done to him, but in a greater way, because the building fell on her and everyone in the building. And he killed more in his death than he did when he was alive. So that's all for this video, for this chapter. So thank you very much for your time. Until next time, we'll look at Judges chapter 17. Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum, Eirini Mazisu, and Pax Vobiscum. Peace be unto you. Maranatha.